I update the global ticket, and that automatically updates all the global linked tickets. And then when I'm ready to, I've fixed the issue, I resolve it, that updates all of the global linked issues. So it simplifies it for the agent, so I only have to worry with that one global ticket rather than updating 42 separate tickets for the people that are experiencing the symptoms. The last one on this list is categorization. I talked a little bit about this in, I think, the last seminar where we were talking about simplifying the service desk. The categorization is something that we do for incident management. And so, and just a couple of points that I'll mention about simplifying categorization. Most people have way too many categories, and if you have several levels of categories, they have things in there that people don't use. They should remove those, or if they're developing it from scratch, they should think of what do they need to report on. So your categorization should be built around what's important for you to capture as far as reporting. Your categorization should not include every single item you could ever think of. That's not what categorization is about. So simplify your categorization. That's both the levels and the number of selections. So try to simplify that. Let's move on to request fulfillment, also known as service request. Some of the things that you can do to simplify that process is, and this is a big one request item per service request. A lot of people design forms where somebody can come in and they can say, well, I need a PC, and I need a new cell phone, and I need access to this system, and they can check the box, so to speak, on 15 different items. Well, and let's ignore for just a minute new hire process, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But if you limit what most people can request to a single record or a single service request, it allows you to build, number one, a much more simple form. So the form is only going to allow one item per service request. It also allows you to now see in your queue how many things really need to get done, because you'll have a service request for each and every item you need to work on. So it simplifies it for the customer filling it out and simplifies it for the agent. Now you're going to say, well, the agent needs 15 different things. Well, generally, unless it's what I'll call an HR type service request, they don't. Generally, most people are putting in a service request for one or two items. And having those two separated out can actually simplify it for your customer as well. The next item on the list here is use a service catalog for standard service requests. Again, I mentioned this up front, that service requests that are standard are things that should be on your service catalog. So using the service catalog feature of your tool, such as in Footprints or Remedy-Force, where maybe there's an icon and you go into the catalog and you can find what it is you want to request and simply choose it from the list. So using a service catalog for those standard service request items greatly simplifies it for your customer, and it also it automatically categorizes it for you. So now you don't have to come back in as an IT agent and categorize the service request. It's pre-categorized. The third thing on this list is, why not just automate any standard service request? So if somebody's requesting to install Visio on their desktop, and if that's something that from a license standpoint you just need to know about, but you don't have to approve, anybody in your organization can request that. Why not have that automated such that it's pushed out? Well, products such as Footprints, of course, can do that. You can set up rules that if it's even if it's approved, it needs approval. You can say once it's approved, it's going to go ahead and use maybe another tool. So you can use the tool, the business rule, for example, in Footprints or Remedy-Force, to then make the call to maybe a product like BMC Client Manager, for example, BCM, which was formerly called Footprints Asset Core. And then that can push out Visio to that desktop. So we can capture what desktop is it, what is the product, and we can make this, as I mentioned in the parentheses here, no humans have to touch this. So we can automate the process. So if there's things that can be automated, use the tool to automate them. That simplifies it certainly for the customer, because they get it kind of lickety-split. They put in the request, and within no time it's been pushed out and the software's been deployed, and it certainly simplifies it for the IT staff. Some additional service request items that can help simplify your service request. You can work non-standard service requests over in release management or in project management. If you remember back on the diagram, I had arrows going from non-standard service requests over to release management and project management. Now, I mentioned those as queues, but what we do is, for example, in Footprints, we set those up as separate items, and then we manage those. The releases are managed by a release manager, and maybe we have lots of feature requests that have come in, and we decide which features will be bundled in a certain release. Or maybe it's not. Maybe features come in and it's something that's needed right away, so it's basically a release of its own. So there's things that you can do in release management, and this is why I think release management is one of the top 4 processes that a small, mid-sized business needs to implement, because you can now simplify things by working those in their own queue. And the reason you do this is because the workflow is different. So because there's a development effort maybe, so you'll need to track the different steps of that workflow. So what you do is you move it to a release item, and you manage the workflow there. It's much easier and more simple to manage all your development life cycles in your release management item. Same thing with projects. So if something comes in and it's not just a feature request or enhancement request or something, it's, as I like to say, bigger than a bread box, and somebody's requesting maybe a new system, well, that maybe needs a project. So you're going to manage that as a project. So copy it over to your project management item and manage it, the workflow there. Keep in mind that anything that's copied over to release management or to project management still has a link back to the original request that came in. So we can always see the customer that can come into the service desk, and they can see that they're linked to a release or a project. They may not be able to see the details of that, but certainly you could post updates to their request so they can stay abreast of it. But you manage the rest of the workflow or the project or the release in the proper queue. The second item here is limit types of service requests. And I'll tell you that there's basically 3 types of requests. Everything can kind of be lumped into one of these 3. People are requesting hardware, software, or access. So you don't have to get real fancy with all these lots of different types. You may have subtypes, of course. Your subtypes for access may be what are the systems somebody can access and what level of permission. But you don't have to have 42 different types of service requests. And then the last one on the list here, I kind of alluded to earlier, and I like to refer to it as human resource or HR service requests. These are a little bit different. You cannot limit an HR service request, such as a new hire, to simply one item. You can't say, well, I'm a manager and I'm putting in a request. I've got a new person starting on Wednesday, Bubba, next Wednesday, and so he needs a laptop, a cell phone, a desktop phone. He needs 5 different items, hardware items. He needs access to 12 different systems. You can't force me to put in 25 different requests, and no, you shouldn't. So what we do is we set up a separate service request system or item, and in Footprints we now call these items, but it could be a workspace or whatever. We set up something separate just for human resource service requests. Now you can do that and separate that out of your standard service desk for a couple reasons. Excuse me. One is not everybody in the company needs access to that. In a perfect world, the only people putting in HR service request might be the people in HR, because they know who's the new hire, the separations, and the role changes, because they'll get those requests. And then if you have things broken down into, based upon job code, what hardware, software, and access they need, they can do the request. Unfortunately, it's not always a perfect world, I know. So we usually assign that job to the hiring manager. So you would not give access to the whole world to this HR service request system. You would give access just to hiring managers. That simplifies things a little bit, and the fact that now you don't accidentally have Bubba putting in a service request to terminate somebody he doesn't like. So this is one that I will tell you that this item gets a lot of debate and could be controversial, but this has been implemented very successfully in a lot of accounts I've been to. So work HR service requests, those are service requests that have multiple items in a separate queue. Excuse me. Moving on to change management. So the change management process, I mentioned earlier, I love the change management process. There's so much return on investment, ROI for change management if you're doing it properly. Some things you can do to simplify this is don't create the request for change. That's what RFC stands for, request for change. Don't create the RFC until you're ready to move something into production. So if you're doing a big development life cycle and 6 months worth of testing, well, that should be done where? In release management, right? Manage the workflow there. When you're ready to move this into production, and by the way, that is an IT only process, I should say. And I truly believe change management is an internal process, because what we want to do is vet the change. We want to make sure this change isn't going to break something else. So we want to reduce the risk, right? So what we want to do is wait until we're ready to move it into production. And I don't mean to the last minute, of course. Generally, there's a 2-week minimum. And so it needs to be in at least 2 weeks before the change is moved into production. But work the rest of the processes, the workflows outside of change management. This greatly simplifies the forms and the information that's captured in the RFC. So create the RFC when you're ready to move it into production, and then now this change management process becomes simply vetting the change to make sure the change isn't going to break something else. You obviously would link the original incident or service request to the change, so we'd always be able to look back and see where this came from. And then this is change management I already mentioned this, it's an internal IT process. We don't usually get customers involved because the customers don't know what this will break and what it's not going to break. Those are things that we need the subject matter experts to look at. So that's why change management is an internal process. And then, of course, and I mentioned this when I did the change management webinar, limit yourself to just the 3 ITIL types of changes: emergency, normal, and standard, which I call routine. So you don't need in-between types of changes. Well, we had something that's a high priority, but it's not really an emergency. No, simplify things, and believe me, it'll run much smoother if you stick with just these 3. All right, release management process. So some things we can do to simplify the release management is to create a release request anytime there's a development effort involved. I mentioned somebody puts in a request for maybe a new report or maybe a new feature of an application. Well, this isn't going to happen maybe overnight, so we need to manage that workflow, that process in release management. We will again link the original back to the original service request so we can see who this came from and maybe keep the person that in the service desk aware of the process.